I think our challenge is to figure out how we can create the conditions for students to motivate themselves. And in the long term, that's good for them, better for us. But it isn't easy.
And welcome, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, guys, gals, and non-binary pals, to another episode of All the Above, the show that gives you an unstandardized take on education. I'm Jeffrey Garrett, one of your co-hosts, and I've been a middle and high school principal and a high school social studies teacher. And as always, I'm joined by...
What up, family? It's Manuel, your favorite teacher's favorite teacher. I'm a high school history teacher here in the Los Angeles area, and this, of course, is All the Above, your home for news and analysis of all matters pertaining to our world, our wild, wild world of education. Shout out to those of you who might be joining us for the first time. This is episode 101. But it's only full episode 101. We have, in between these video episodes, we have a podcast only passing period type of show that's just me and Jeff. And, we drop those too. But if you are brand new to our show, we thank you for being here. We welcome you to this wonderful space to have dope conversations with dope guests. And Jeff, it's a dope time of year because spring has sprung. It's not super hot out, but it's not cold no more either. It's testing season. I know you're a very big fan of testing season. So, man, here we are, man. Look at us. Here we are.
Manuel, yes, here we are. Spring has sprung. I am getting ready to conclude my sabbatical. That folks who've been listening to the show know that I have been on now for a few months and getting ready to return to work, which means by the time you all see this episode, I will be neck deep in work once again. And it is, I'm both excited because I genuinely enjoy my job and the team I get to work with and all of that. And also, let's be real, everybody would love to be on sabbatical instead of having to get up and go to work every day. And so there's, a little bit of sadness that that time is coming to a close. But also, Manuel, speaking of sprunging, I am getting ready to travel back to the land of my birth, the state of Minnesota.
Yeah.
And it is about to be like 60, 65 degrees. It's going to be almost the same temperature there that's going to be here in LA. So spring is sprung, man. The snow is almost melted in Minnesota. So
nice.
It's a beautiful thing. Of course, in that part of the country, it means the season of mud has now begun.
Ooh.
But they'll take it.
Yeah, man, for sure. And out here in California, man, we got so much snow. Obviously not here where we live, but parts of California have gotten so much snow, record amounts, that I guess there's also the concern that springtime is going to bring a level of melting and potential flooding that we are not very accustomed to out here in California. So if you live in California, obviously stay safe. We, hoping for the best for everybody as that giant snowpack starts to melt. And Jeff, it's also, as you come back to the workforce and end your sabbatical, those of us in the classroom, it's that time of year where some folks, myself maybe included, maybe not, but some folks start counting down to the end of the school year because it's right there in our grasp. We're almost there, about a month and a half, depending on where you teach. Longer than that if you're on the East Coast, but hang in there, folks, because the school year is wrapping up, and this time of year tends to go pretty quickly, at least in my classroom experience. So, Jeff, though, of course, here on All the Above, we keep the learning going regardless of what the school calendar is talking about. So I know we have a super dope guest in the building today. So, Jeff, let us know what is on today's agenda.
Yes, Manuel, I will let you know that information. I just need to say for the record, for the All of the Above audience, officially, I have never counted down the days to the end of the school year.
Of course not.
Never stoop to that level or engage in such unproductive behavior, Manuel. I would love it if there were 180 days left as of today. That's right. My official statement, and I'm sticking to it.
Yeah.
All All right, so back to serious conversation. Manuel, for now, the 101st time in a row, I am proud to officially say we got a good one for everybody. And today we are bringing back onto the show a guest we have had previously. It's been a couple of years now since he has joined us, but he is a well-known name, a prolific author, and really, I would just say like voice in the field of education, Larry Ferlazzo, who is a Sacramento-based teacher who also writes for Education Week, who writes his own blog, has published numerous books, is a teacher of English language learners, so has done a lot, of course, in that particular field. But Larry is going to be joining us today because he has a brand new book out. It's hot off the presses. I'm going to put it up right here and hope it doesn't mess up the focus on my camera as I'm talking. But it's a hot new book out. It is called The Student Motivation Handbook, 50 Ways to Boost an Intrinsic Desire to Learn. And it's excellent timing because this topic of motivation is one that I think is often right behind a lot of the conversations that we want to have, or that we do have, about the conditions that educators face in school, about the work, the quality of pedagogy that we are employing with our students. And so I think it's just a really well-timed topic, especially in this kind of quote-unquote post-pandemic era, for us to really dig into like what is happening with student motivation, what are the things that educators can do to create the right conditions for intrinsic student motivation in the classroom. So going to be a fascinating conversation, folks. You definitely don't want to miss it.
Yeah, sounds dope. Some Sacramento dopeness in the building. Can't wait for that. Yeah, that's right. Like the Beam. Great time of year for them as well.
The three seed kings, Manuel.
Exactly. Playoff. Well, actually, by the time this episode posts, let's hope they're still in the playoffs. Let's hope. All right, folks. Up next, though, before we get into the conversation with Larry Ferlazzo, we're going to have our Do Now and take a look at recent news and headlines in the world of education. Stay tuned. All right, folks. Now it's time for today's Do Now. Let's take a look at some news and headlines in the world of education. Jeff, how are we going to do the Do Now today?
Well, Manuel, today we are taking attendance. We got to find out who's here in many parts of the country, at least as we are sitting and recording this episode. Spring break has just happened, and as everyone knows, attendance on the first day back from spring break can sometimes be a little spotty, a little sketchy. Got some extended vacations happening, but we gotta take roll, see who's in the house today, Manuel.
Yeah. All right. Got to make sure that attendance is accurate, especially with testing season upon us. You got to make sure a certain percentage of your enrolled students take these tests. These tests 95. Are very important for all sorts of reasons. So yeah, let's make sure we got an accurate count, Jeff. All right. So who we got first on today's roll call?
All right, Manuel. First up on today's roll call is a concept, Manuel. It's a concept that is in short supply, especially among whiny, lazy young people, Manuel, who didn't have to walk uphill both ways to school every day, and that is tough love.
Tough love. Yeah, Jeff, I don't know. That's an odd one to be on a roll call. That's one of those names I'd come across, and I'd be like, am I sure this is the name? And I'd, probably ask, is there a student whose last name is Love in the building? And then, walk over to them and make sure I'm right. I have had a student with the name I'm in Love. Shout out to Iman, a comedian up there, now a stand-up comedian up in Sacramento, but his name was I'm in Love, and I remember thinking, I think that was purposeful. I'm in Love as his actual government name. So yeah, tough love, baby. This is one of those type of characters, Jeff. I don't know.
Yeah. That actually would be kind of a dope, real name, like TUFFLUV.
Yeah, exactly.
Would be pretty dope. Okay. Yes, that's a cool concept. It's not what we're talking about today. Specifically, Manuel, what we're talking about today is the official comeback of tough love in the classroom when it comes to grading, Manuel. Enough of this Dr. Rustin give them all A's business. Okay, we're going to talk about this today with, in all seriousness, a fascinating story that was published just recently in the 74 Million. So shout out to them. This story was written by Kevin Mencken, and let's get into it here. According to a paper released last fall through Brown University's Annenberg Institute for School Reform, 8th and 9th graders who learned from math teachers with relatively higher performance standards earned better test scores in Algebra 1. The same students saw their improved results carry forward to subsequent years, and they were less likely to be absent from school than similar students assigned to more lax graders. The study is built on grading and testing records for a huge swath of North Carolina students who took Algebra 1 in either 8th or 9th grades. In all, the sample included over 365,000 students across 27,000 classrooms and about 4,400 teachers over a 10-year span. To assess the impact of different standards, researchers used multiple measures of grading severity, relying on the relationship between course grades and performance on end-of-year exams. So, for example, an algebra teacher whose students tend to receive higher course grades than their test scores would indicate what's considered to be an easier grader and vice versa. Across several metrics of academic success, students who were exposed to higher grading standards fared better than their peers, compared with students who had previously demonstrated similar levels of math performance. Those assigned to stricter graders saw larger scoring gains. Notably, those effects were both sizable and linear, meaning that the tighter the grading practices, moving from easiest grading to the very hardest, the larger the improvement was on test scores. The results of higher standards were broadly similar for a range of different students. While higher performing math students enjoyed marginally larger gains than their relatively lower performing classmates, the effects were ultimately beneficial across 20 different student demographic categories, differing by race, sex, class rank, and prior achievement level in math. So Manuel, the research is in. You hate students because you are a lax grader and you are making them all fail algebra. How do you respond?
I am super woke, Jeff. I am super woke, so that's what we get. That's what we get. I hand out participation trophies at the end of the semester.
That's right.
Yeah. All right. So yeah, this is a very interesting working paper here, and I guess my biggest question about it is their use, what I would consider a very loose usage of the term high standards for their grading, because this is absolutely entirely based on student scores on the standardized test end of course exam. And basically, as you just explained there, they're looking at end of course exam test scores and comparing students' test scores with the grades they got to try to determine which teachers have tougher grading or so-called higher standards, higher grading standards with regards to the actual outcomes. And, there's a whole lot of problems with that. Just generally speaking, I mean, using this one measure, this end of course exam, and not gathering data on all the other things that matter in terms of like, how do these students feel about their actual math identity? How do these students feel about their their ability to impact the world and be, all the great things that we do in education, to boil it all down to the test score. Maybe their test scores are higher in these particular classrooms, but maybe they also feel worse about school, but we don't know that based on this particular study. And I'm not saying that this study needed to look into that, because obviously that's probably beyond the scope of what they are trying to do right here. But, that's important consideration. One thing that definitely stood out to me was that they found that the teachers who are in that tougher grading, that higher grading standards category, were more likely to be more experienced and to be white and to be female. To me, that automatically draws into question a lot of the takeaways from a study like this, because if they're more experienced, let's take out the more likely to be white and female part. If they're more experienced, then we already know, those of us who have worked in schools for a very long time, we already know that the teachers with more seniority who are more experienced, they tend to have a bit more say-so in what students end up on their rosters and what their classes actually look like and what they're actually teaching. And I think that obviously will have a large influence on a study like this. It also goes to show, and I think we talked about this a lot when it comes to like teachers of color, myself, and you probably maybe could relate to this as well, Jeff. But I know when I entered the teaching profession as a black male, I immediately was given the toughest classes with the toughest students. And I remember my principal my first year saying like, "Wow, you're doing such a good job. Students really like your class, and it's amazing because there's so many gang members in your class." And it's just like, oh, okay, if that's how you want to view them. But so all those sorts of things, I think, could get lost in conversation if we simply look at the test scores they got at the end and then how those test scores correlate to grades. If we're making the claim here, it seems like they're implying that the test score is the real measure of their academic ability when it comes to math. If that's the case, then why not just make the grades automatic based on their test scores? Like if test scores are that pure to their math ability, and if grades are supposed to be that pure to their math ability, then take grading out of the equation for teachers and just let the end of course grade be whatever they got on their test. But of course, we're not going to do that because we know there's so much more that goes into it. So I just think, there's a lot of research to support that grading, and especially like high stakes, high standards type grading, that tough love isn't really great for for boosting academic outcomes. And there's research that shows that it is like this here. So I think at this point in time, grade inflation seems to be what these authors say is the real big problem. I agree. Grade inflation, grades, I don't know what they mean anymore. So to me, the solution wouldn't be to build up higher standards and grading, so-called, but the solution would be to move away from grades as those in Human Restoration Project, a lot of other folks have been advocating for the ungrading space where it's more based on feedback and student growth than it is like earning an actual letter. So, those are my immediate thoughts on this paper, Jeff. I'm interested to hear what you think about it.
Yeah, well, my first set of thoughts, Manuel, is that feelings are for losers, communists, and people who hate freedom. So, period, end of sentence there, okay? No, in all seriousness, I think you bring up some good points. What actually really fascinated me about this article, Manuel, is I think there's a layer of language that's being used in the study and in the reporting on the study and in our discussion that actually is like makes it harder to get at what I think at least are some of the real central issues here. So when we talk about like harder graders or people who are grading with a quote, higher standard, I think what's actually being described here is teachers whose grading system better reflects students' level of mastery of the skills and content that's being assessed on the state exam, right? So these are folks who have a tighter match between, let's say a B represents you have mastery over 80% of stuff. And I know that's an oversimplification, but for the sake of discussion, let's say in that type of teacher's classroom, that's what that means. So you get a B in the class and then you get an 80 on the test, right? And there's some, sort of reliability between those two different measures that would give the indication that like the teacher is upholding the same level of rigor or level of expectation as the standardized assessment, right? And for all kinds of reasons in an education system, whether we like it or not, that is heavily driven towards success outcomes that are test-based, that can be a useful practice, right? So I think that actually in some ways talking about it through that lens might be a more helpful way for us to think about like what's actually being said here, right? And I think honestly, probably all of us can acknowledge that teachers that have huge discrepancies between test scores, level of proficiency versus grades level of proficiency, it at least raises some questions about like, okay, what is happening in this classroom in terms of the message that's being sent to kids and families and in terms of the kind of feedback that's being sent to students about their learning, right? And so that's at least like worth exploring, right? Now, also, with this one, well, I think you have the issue where students, or the sort of multi-year effects that they're showing for students, right? So students who had a quote-unquote tougher grader in Algebra 1, that they saw long-term benefits of their learning even moving through geometry and Algebra 2, which is the typical course sequence in North Carolina. So that I thought was interesting, Manuel, because it also speaks to, if you are in a class where you're getting feedback that's aligned to your level of understanding and mastery that is matching what's expected by the state test scores, that maybe equips you with the kind of information you need in order to learn skills and content that then builds foundational both understandings, habits, etc., that could have legs for you, right? Long-term impact throughout your educational experience. So from that standpoint, I think it's interesting. I don't think, to me, it actually calls us to say like, well, we got to fail more kids, right? Like, so, because I think in some people's minds, that's what tough grading standards looks like, right? It looks like only a few people do well and everyone else does poorly type of a thing. And I think, to me, that's not what this data is actually suggesting. And I would be curious to see in those teachers' classrooms, did they have, for example, like very few students fail, but also maybe very few students get like high A's, right? And so maybe there is, sort of a middle ground sweet spot that's addressing some of the grade inflation issue, but also giving good feedback to students about their performance that helps them actually grow and improve and avoid those, really toxic experiences that can happen when kids experience repeated failure in school. So to me, it's interesting. I know it's not gonna, necessarily convince a wide-eyed woke mob teacher like yourself, Manuel, who hates freedom, but for other people, maybe it opens the door to a discussion.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. Possibly. I am worried, though, that it will be misused by folks. Same type of folks that keep arguing about learning loss. I think this is a headline that they could point to say, see, all those. I mean, the article itself from the 74, where we picked up this story about the study. The article itself mentions how different districts like Los Angeles and San Diego and others have moved towards trying to have more equitable grading practices or eliminate D's and F's and do different things. So like the article itself is pointing to these moves that are being made. And then like, this study comes out showing that actually, quote unquote, lower standards for grading doesn't help. And in fact, it might hurt or whatever. I think folks could point to something like this and say, see, that's why we need more math, more English, more everything. And also we need to get back to old school grading. Back in my day, you didn't get no A or B just for showing up. You had to do this and that. So I think it could be misused. I'm not saying the authors are of that mindset, but I think this is one of those studies that could be dangerous in terms of, folks who are trying to push back against all the moves that have been made in the name of equity. So we shall see.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent point, Manuel, and definitely the learning loss hawks out there will probably see in this story whatever they need to see to continue to berate educators and blame us for the failures of all of society and whatnot. But I think for educators and folks who are interested, there's actually some really fascinating questions in here about like, what kind of grading should we be doing with kids? And what connection is there between, the feedback you receive to help you grow and improve and the grade that you get, which, it gets boiled down by definition to this like single letter or single number, that sort of thing. So I think it's actually really fascinating.
Yeah, for sure. All right, Jeff, but that's only the first name on today's roll call, Jeff. We have another that we got to see if he's in the building. Next name is Nelson.
Nice, Nelson. I had a student named Nelson. I hope I'm not betraying any trust here, Manuel. But a student of mine, when I was a teacher back in New York, brilliant young man, was not only my student in class, but also was on our student government that I coordinated with the students. So whenever I hear the name Nelson, I think brilliant young man Nelson, who's now like 30 or something, like brilliant grown man Nelson from the Bronx. That's what I think.
For sure. Well, this Nelson is a bit different than that Nelson by the sounds, by the description that you just gave. This is Nelson Muntz. Nelson Muntz from The Simpsons, Jeff. Remember Nelson? He was the bully, the one that always like,
nice. Let me not embarrass myself here, Manuel, but the one who used to go, ha,
that's
all the time.
One. That's the one, Jeff. And, Nelson was sort of the, prototypical, like, bully that would exist at school campuses. And clearly, if you're around and Nelson wasn't around, there was a cause for concern, a little bit of concern at least. And this story has to do with bullies, Jeff. Kind of. Not just bullies, but all sorts of violence and harassment and bullying that might take place on school grounds. And of course, lately there's been a lot of discussion about restorative justice practices and police on, or school resource officers, quote unquote, police on school campuses, and the safety and lack of safety on school campuses these days, Jeff. And we have a really fascinating study conducted by UCLA, the world's #1 public university, about how are schools, in this case, California middle and high schools, how are they right now when it comes to bullying and students' feelings around safety? All right, so we got this story by way of EdSource, thanks to some reporting by Ali Tadayan, and he talks about this new study out of UCLA. So this study from UCLA's Luskin School of Public Affairs shows that during the 2 decades prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a steep and steady reduction in serious forms of violence, including bullying and weapons-related behaviors across California's middle and high school campuses. The study analyzed 18 years of data from the California Healthy Kids Survey, which is an anonymous questionnaire given each year to all of California's students who are in grades 5, 7, 9, and 11, and it asked them about school climate, safety, and student wellness and youth resiliency. And this study out of UCLA found some noteworthy findings include that there has been a 56% reduction in physical fights, a 70% reduction in reports of carrying a gun onto school grounds, a 59% reduction in being threatened by a weapon on school grounds, and larger declines in victimization reported by Black and Latino students compared to white students. Now, one of the authors of the study, Ron Avi Astor, was quoted as saying that these findings were evident in more than 95% of California schools in every county and not in wealthy suburban schools only. Now, Ron Avi Astor, who's a UCLA scholar, he says that these results suggest that eruptions of gun violence, which are obviously making news across the nation, should be treated as a separate social and psychological phenomenon. Well, Jeff, looks like school violence, despite all the claims that these restorative justice practices, this woke stuff, has made it so that violence is rampant on school campuses and we need cops back in schools and all that. Back in schools, they're still in schools, but for those that remove them. What are your thoughts about this study showing that actually, at least in California, middle and high schools, there's a pretty sizable reduction in violence and bullying and fights and weapons and all that, at least according to the students on this Healthy Kids survey? Yeah.
So first of all, I love this data, Manuel. From the standpoint of there are questions perhaps to be asked about whether what is captured in this survey data, that is like perception and self-reported data from students, from staff at schools, whether that also tracks tightly with like reported data from districts or, school police or, the other types of entities that might be capturing, reports of these same kinds of incidents. But I have to say, given the size of the data set and given the people who are speaking about their own experience, like, do you feel safe at your school? And do you feel like you're, likely to get beat up at school or those sorts of things? This is really helpful and hopeful data, Manuel, because we live in a world where I'm just going to keep it real here, where there are very concerted right-wing efforts to paint the public school system as a system that is perpetually in deep crisis, and that is also like really doing harm to our kids every day, whether that's with quote unquote woke curriculum or whether that's with violence, right? Or permissive, policies like restorative justice that allow violence to run rampant and this sort of thing. And what we hear in this space, Manuel, is sort of the echoes of the same thing that these kind of folks say about big cities in America like Chicago. Every time they say, what about Chicago? Oh, you care about solving gun violence, but what about Chicago? Or, New York is full of criminals and, it smells and all these other things that they say, right? And so I think it's important that we see the attacks against especially our nation's public school system in that through that same kind of prism, right? And this is really helpful data to give us a sort of counterpoint to say, like, actually, nobody's out here advocating that everything's perfect in schools, right? And schools have been doing a lot over the last couple of decades, especially to make right some of the wrongs of the past and to set up systems that are much more thoughtful about addressing a lot of the persistent bullying, a lot of the homophobic centered bullying, a lot of the racist, threats of violence and centered bullying that was, in the quote unquote good old days that these right wing folks always like to reminisce on, in the 1950s, that frankly was one of the key hallmarks of school back then. And I think what this tells us is that the efforts we are making at creating restorative communities in schools, at creating, structures and systems in schools that offer safe spaces for marginalized youth, right? That offer supportive structures for English learners instead of structures that just say, you're a weird foreigner, go over there and learn English and you have no value to us until you learn English and we're going to beat your culture out of you, or, those kinds of things, that we are making progress in those areas. And again, I'm not here to say it's perfect. I'm not here to say we don't have work to do, but I find this encouraging and hopeful in a world where we don't have enough encouraging and hopeful data and where educators are constantly under attack, disingenuous attack from folks who don't really care about public education, but love to, sort of throw us under the bus publicly. So I'm excited about this data, man. Well, it gives me a sense of okay, we are trying some things and we know we're not there yet, but we also know it could be having a real impact. And our students are demonstrating this with long-term survey data.
Yeah, I'm also excited about this. This is one of those rare, I guess, good stories that we report on here on All the Above. Because I feel like a lot of our Do Now stories, a lot of our stories we talk about, generally speaking, just how much calamity there is out here in the education world. And this data here, 18 years worth of data from students, from their own perspective, about how safe they feel on campus. And it's very encouraging to see these numbers. These numbers kind of caught me off guard. I've just in my own experience in the classroom, just my own, experience as a teacher, I feel that things are a lot better than they used to be, but I don't know how much of that is just my school changing or how much of that is our policy change or what. It's just my own individual experience. So to hear or to see that students across the state have been indicating that, yeah, bullying is way down. Fights are way down. I do feel safer. There are less incidents of weapons. I see, to me, that's highly, highly encouraging. And I do wish data like this would get the same kind of headlines that test score data gets every time test scores get released. Those are all big headlines across the state and across the nation. Data like this gets released. This was not a big headline. And in fact, I had to look at the little, list of they have a little section on the EdSource website. Shout out to EdSource, by the way, for all their reporting on all things education in California. But it was their little, what's latest little section. It wasn't one of the big lead stories or anything like that. And I wish stories like this did gain more prominence in our discussions, because there are a lot of folks out there who are trying to paint a picture of our public schools being just Wild West, just violent, and you can't do anything. Teachers are powerless now because all these woke laws make it so that a teacher just has to sit there while students curse at them and do this and that. And certainly there are classrooms and schools across the country where there are real issues. But generally speaking, things are looking really good thanks to a lot of the policy changes that we've made. So being a classroom teacher for 19 years, there are two things that I always think about in terms of giant changes that I've seen and just what it's like to be a young person in a California school. And one is obviously the impact of technology and how students now are so glued to their phones, to their devices, as in comparison to students when I first entered the classroom. But also just how calm it seems. It just seems, and I've taught at two different schools in terms of my proper teaching career, not my student teaching. But it just seems in general that there's less fights going on. I remember I used to be breaking up fights left and right. There's a lot of discipline going on, a lot of suspensions left and right, all that. And there's just a lot less of that now. And, just knowing that we're not just suspending kids left and right like we used to, I think that's one of the reasons why schools feel better now, because a lot has been done in certain districts and certain schools to help students feel better about school and make schools feel less like a prison. Of course, there's still schools out there in districts that still have those zero tolerance policies. Of course, we've got to keep advocating for more restorative practices, and we got to advocate for getting getting rid of police in schools because they don't make campuses safer. But there's also, I think a lot to show for, the changes that have already been made in areas where they have been made. And I like that this study makes a distinction between the day-to-day type of school violence and bullying and safety from not the bigger, but a really big issue that we've seen too much across the country over the last few decades now, and it just seems to be on the increase, which is, of course, mass shootings on school grounds. And the authors of the study pointing that, there's two different things going on here. So like every time there's another shooting on a school ground, there's more people coming out talking about, we got to arm the teachers, we got to lock down the schools, we got to do all this stuff. And it's like, that's not the way to go. And secondly, don't even start to even insinuate that the changes in our discipline policies and the changes in how we interact with kids on campus has anything to do with the violence that we're seeing through these school shootings. These are two very separate issues, and I'm glad the authors pointed that out.
Yeah. Yep. I love it, man. In the words of the great Reverend Jesse Jackson, Manuel, this is the kind of data that lets you keep hope alive. So let's do that.
For sure. All right, folks, that about does it for this week's Do Now. Up next, we have a dope seminar conversation with Larry Ferlazzo. All right, stay tuned. That's coming up next.
Hey folks, thanks so much for tuning in to All the Above. We really appreciate you. And as you know, All the Above is a small operation. It's just me and just Manuel, that's it. We have no sponsorships, which means we are totally dependent on our amazing audience to help support the show. So here's what you can do. Go to our website, which is aotashow.com/support. That's aotashow.com/support. There you can find links to everything you can do to support the show. You find all the links to every platform that we're on where you can like, subscribe, follow. Make sure you share our show with your whole network. Also, you can donate there. We are on Venmo. We're on Cash App, and most importantly, you can find the link to our Anchor page where you can become a monthly patron. Even a small donation once a month will make a huge difference in helping us continue to produce the show. Lastly, you can find there the link to get your flyest, best, latest, all the above show merch. Okay, all you gotta do is go to aotashow.com/support. Thanks, enjoy the rest of the show. All right, folks, welcome to today's seminar. Thanks so much for joining us. And we are thrilled to be here today with a guest who we've had on the show before, but we're very excited to have him back today. He is here with us not only to talk about a fascinating topic around student motivation, but also the brand spanking new book he has written on this subject as well. It is none other than Larry Ferlazzo. Larry, welcome back to All the Above.
Well, thanks for the invitation. I can sincerely say I'm honored to be especially invited for a second time. So I guess hopefully I didn't blow it too badly the first time around.
Oh, not at all. Not at all. Folks, let me tell you a little bit more about our guest today. Larry Ferlazzo has been a high school teacher since 2003 after spending 19 years working as a community organizer. He teaches beginner, intermediate, and advanced English language learners, as well as English proficient students at Luther Burbank High School in Sacramento, California. Larry is a prolific author with more than a dozen books to his credit now, including the including the English Language Learners Teacher's Toolbox and his newest book, the Student Motivation Handbook, 50 Ways to Boost an Intrinsic Desire to Learn. Larry has taught in the teacher credentialing programs at Cal State Sacramento and at UC Davis, and his works have appeared in the New York Times, ASCD's Education Leadership, and the Washington Post. And Larry hosts a monthly radio show on BAM Education Radio. He also writes a popular blog available at larryferlazzo.edublogs.org, which of course we'll link to below the episode here, and writes a regular blog with Education Week called Classroom Q&A with Larry Ferlazzo. Larry, so excited to have you back on All the Above, and I'm going to kick it over to Manuel for our first question.
Yeah. Larry Ferlazzo in the building.
Great. Well, thank you. And I should also add just one quick thing to my bio is that the basketball team I played on since 2014 has come in last place in our league every year since that date. So
Wow.
I'm not going to give up my day job to try out for the pros.
Got you. Hey, but you're in Sacramento, you know what I'm saying? Light the
Yeah.
beam and all that good stuff. So,
Yeah.
you know, something to be happy about.
Yeah, we are indeed.
Yeah. Well, Larry, thank you so much for coming back on all of the above. And of course, your new handbook, the Student Motivation Handbook, 50 Ways to Boost an Intrinsic Desire to Learn. Hot off the press. Thank you very much for sending some copies for us to look through. You know, I'm not going to lie to you. I'm a 19-year classroom vet like yourself, and I'm in the classroom, and it's a lot being in the classroom. And I'll be honest, I don't really have time during the school year for books. I don't have time for new books about teaching, at least. That's just me. But here we have something that's very accessible, if I do say so myself. A handbook, very succinct and very, very important topic right now. It's always been an important topic since, you know, I remember student teaching, the conversations around motivation and how do you motivate students to today in this post-lockdown pandemic world where it's motivation appears to be or seems to be one of the greater struggles that I see a lot of teachers, veteran and you, having with their students in terms of boosting their intrinsic desire to learn. So thank you very much for putting this handbook together. And I just want to ask you, why do you see this as an important topic in education right now? And what about those teachers out there? I think we all know them who say, you know what, I'm not really here to motivate students. Like that's on the student, that's on the family. I'm not here to entertain and do all that. Like I'm going to teach my content and it's up to the student to step up to it, and if not, that's on them. So what do you say to that, to those teachers who think, this motivation conversation, like, nah, that's not really important to me?
Well, when I was a community organizer, we've talked a lot about the world as it is and contrast that to the world as we'd like it to be. And I live in the world as it is. Right. In the world as I'd like it to be, which we should work towards, right. And which we all aspire to. Yes. The students want to learn what I want to teach. Right. And, my kids should want to clean their rooms without being prompted. Right. Right. I mean, there are lots of things that should happen in the world as we'd like it to be, but I live in the world as it is, and I mean it's when you were asking this, it reminds me a few years ago there was this big new study about the best ways to study, the best ways for students to study, and they were great, right? However, it's not really going to matter much if kids don't want to do it, right? I actually wrote about it and asked the authors about that, and they said, well, getting students to do these study habits was outside the purview of our research, right?
Right.
I mean, it's just and there's this gap, right? And it's almost classical or stereotypical that a lot of people are not connected to reality. And I can speak from my experience. I've seen a lot of that particularly in the college arena, where a lot of instructors could use some work on pedagogy and training in pedagogy, where they just think that, okay, my job is just to present and students' job is to learn. So, but the bottom line is I live in the world as it is. I have a pretty good idea of what I think students should learn. The standards, I think, generally have a pretty good idea of what students could learn. But it's just not going to matter a whole lot if they're not motivated to do it. I mean, you can use carrots and sticks, and I certainly have. Right. Again, I live in the world as it is. but those tend to only work over a short period of time. And I think that our challenge is to figure out how we can create the conditions for students to motivate themselves. And in the long term, that's good for them, better for us. But it isn't easy, right? And sometimes people complain, oh, people are so apathetic, our students are so apathetic. But the bottom line is everybody's interested in something. It's just not necessarily what we want them to be interested in. So our job is to try to build those bridges between what we hope they can learn or do and how they see it in their self-interest and how it connects to their hopes and dreams to learn those things.
Yeah, really appreciate that, Larry. And you're making me think a lot about the ways in which students often in real time demonstrate what they are interested in relative to what they're being compelled to be interested in by the credit requirements of the state or the schedule of the school, or those sorts of things. When we see behaviors in classes that involve kids engaging in social activity as opposed to digging deeply into the text, or those sorts of things, and the ways in which all of that often can lead to sort of power struggles in the classroom or in the school, more broadly, and perhaps the hope that what you're writing about in this book offers us, not only to do some of the really self-actualizing kinds of things that I think you just named about helping to hone students' ability to find intrinsic motivation, but also to reduce some of the forms of conflict that happens in schools when motivations don't align between the school and what it's accountable for and the students and what they're interested in. Interesting, kind of intersection of issues there.
Well, your point about power. I mean, I still remember a teacher once told me, I never let a student get the last word. And I'm thinking, in a power struggle, we teachers will always lose, right? I mean, we may think we win over the short term, but we will always lose, right? And to not know that is just incredible. And this idea of intrinsic motivation, it's not about watering down standards or watering down academic content. It's just figuring out how to connect all of that with the key elements that are required to have intrinsic motivation flourish.
Yeah. And that is what we call a great segue into our second question for you, Larry, which starts right where you left off there. So you cite research in the book that essentially argues that there's 4 core components that need to be in place in order to create the conditions for intrinsic motivation to happen and flourish. Those being autonomy, competence, relatedness, and relevance. So first of all, would love to hear you, try to summarize your book briefly, but try to capture what those terms really mean to you for the benefit of our listeners here, and then also in a world where educators have tons of content that they're responsible to cover by June. How can educators really start to go about integrating these things into their practice, with some regularity, right, when they're in those kind of work conditions?
Right. Well, and again, I don't think we're talking about adding more to our plate. I think it's sort of subtracting some of the ways we do things for the processes that will further support intrinsic motivation when we're teaching the content. And autonomy just basically means that students have some control over what they're doing and when they're doing it, right? Whether in terms of the classroom, some control over who they might be working with in a small group. When students are writing essays, not necessarily everybody's writing to the same prompt. Maybe they can choose from 3 different prompts. They're, having choice boards where there are, several potential activities that students could do to show that they have mastery over the topic, or different ways that they can choose to learn about the topic. Having multiple strategies for students could do independent practice. For example, I teach both English language learners, newcomers, and I also teach IB classes, which also we try to recruit English language learners to participate in those classes too. All these strategies can apply to all different levels, right? So for independent practice, students can use, there are plenty of different online sites for grammar or for math or for science practice, right? Where students can have a broader range of different activities that they do. Applying inductive learning, where basically students are provided a variety of examples, whether it is, for example, if I'm teaching claims, offering a series of claims that are good claims, well-constructed claims, and ones that aren't, and having students identify why they think these are good and why they're bad, instead of me telling them, right? Where they are basically having to act as detectives to identify it. So those are some ways for autonomy. Competence, where we want students to feel that they are prepared and can be successful in doing the tasks that we're asking them to do. Different ways to do that. There's a concept called temporal comparisons, which all good teachers do anyway. It's a fancy word for it. They're basically creating situations where students can see for themselves how much they've learned, whether it is giving them an essay that they wrote at the beginning of the year as a midterm and say, okay, based on what you learned, can you rewrite this essay? Sharing a list of new vocabulary at the beginning of a unit, having students identify, define them, and then at the end of the unit, having students define them, and they can see what they have learned. One of my most interesting, at least to me, examples of that is one year as an experiment in one of my English classes. I always have students do anonymous evaluations of the class, and for me, and one of the questions is how much better do you of a writer you are, or how much more do you feel like more proficient you've got in English, and along with a bunch of other questions. And one year I had students do that, and then the next week I said, "Oh, folks, I'm sorry, I forgot to include one question in the survey. Can you do it again?" And in the interim, I had students do one of those temporal comparisons where I had students rewrite an essay that they had done, 8 months earlier. And the percentage of students who felt that they learned a lot in the class tripled in that week when they wrote it. After they saw how they could rewrite the essay, such a much greater percentage of students felt like they had learned a whole lot. In competence, creating situations where students can teach their classmates. Jigsaws are perfect examples of that, where students are asked to, create presentations about different aspects of a subject or different parts of a historical figure's life, and then present, or those are some examples for competence. Relatedness is what is what I'm being asked to do, going to bring me into relationship, into contact with people who I like or respect. And small group work, simple things like saying students' names correctly, right? Pronouncing them correctly, and not making it a big deal. If I mess up on pronouncing a student's name, making it clear it's not because their name is difficult, it's because of my inability, my inabilities, not their challenge. Doing weekly Google form check-ins, just where it takes students a minute to see how they're feeling about school, how they're feeling about the class, how they're feeling about their personal life. Is there anything that the teachers should know? So those kind of things to create more of a relationship within the class and with the teacher. And then relevance is what we're asking students to do in class, relevant to their dreams and hopes for themselves, and or it's just something that's interesting to them as well, right? I mean, it doesn't necessarily, it's playing a game. It could be interesting to them, right? I mean, it's and that would relate to relevant. I mean, it's one way to do that is the idea of asking students to self-generate connections. What are ideas they have about what they're learning can connect to their dreams? Exploring ways in the class to make connections to challenges in the community. For example, in our class, our neighborhood was having a very low response rate to the U.S. Census, which has a major impact on resources in the neighborhoods. So students organized a multilingual campaign to get people in the neighborhood to respond to census questions. So, those are the major elements of what it takes to help to support intrinsic motivation, and how to be able to connect that to what we're teaching.
Yeah. And I think, as a teacher who sat in many department meetings and academy meetings and whole staff meetings, and hearing teachers struggle or express their struggles in motivating students or helping students have that intrinsic desire to learn the material. Importantly, you're pointing out that it's not like there's no one thing that you could do, as much as we wish there's just one thing, just give me the answer, give me the assignment that'll just motivate them and get them going. It's very complex. You have all these different aspects to what it takes to help develop an intrinsic motivation to learn. And even with that, you're still going to have some students who, even with those things, are going to not want to go ahead and do that assignment, do that project, or participate in this and that. So it's an ongoing struggle. Of course, all of us in the classroom know that. And some teachers, unfortunately, I think, really lean on grades and their grading system as a way to so-called motivate students. And of course, we all know teachers who use really punitive grading practices because they think that's what's going to, if students know that this assignment is worth 500 bazillion points, then that's going to get them to do it. And, I think research shows that that's not really the best practice. And we talked about grades earlier on this particular episode. And in your handbook, you have a really fascinating rubric for students to self-assess their own learning. In this grading rubric that you have in here, this grade reflection has elements or domains such as self-control and that's a difficult word for me to say. Conscientiousness. Yeah. Y'all know what I mean. Curiosity, ethics, giving, and mastery, and having students really think about their own place or their own performance on these things. So we want to ask you about grades and motivation, because this is a really I think a helpful rubric for those of us that want students to have a bigger say or think a little more deeply about their own role in this, and versus just sitting back and having the teachers issue a grade. So we're really interested in hearing you speak more about the role of grading and what can schools do, or what should schools be doing in terms of their grading practices to really maximize student learning, but also address this big challenge, which is student motivation.
Well, one, I should emphasize that it's also not a question of just all intrinsic motivation or all extrinsic motivation. I think it's more of a question is, where do we tend to put more of our energy on, right? I mean, again, because you live in the world as it is. I've certainly relied on intrinsic motivators sometimes. But I like to think that I put a greater emphasis on intrinsic. And I know there's a lot of torturous hand-wringing about grading among teachers, but I just never really found it to be a huge issue. And I regularly just push students on, this is about learning, not about the grade. You're learning, you learn and the grades will follow. And I really push on self-assessments from students. And when it comes to grades, I would say 90% of the time, if not more, students self-assess the grades that I would objectively give them. And then for the remaining 10%, I give them an opportunity to convince me with evidence that their perspective is more accurate than mine. I think probably some might call me an easy grader, though at the same time, I got to tell you, like in the International Baccalaureate program, we have to do grades. We have to assess student work, and then another teacher has to do the assessments. And the vast majority of the time, the IB examiners agree with the grades that I've given the students. I think generally I think what research has shown has been most effective for learning is some kind of performance assessment. Whether it's a learning project that involves both activity and reflection, that takes a little more time. But generally, I think if students feel, in my experience at least, that we're on the same side, that that the student feels that I want them to be successful, that I will go the extra mile to help them be successful, that in that kind of partnership, it requires efforts on their part as well. The vast majority of students rise to the occasion. As you say, there are always going to be some students who don't. And in many situations, it's because of circumstances far beyond our control or their control, because of their life experiences. But more often than not, I think it's possible to teach, without having the grades be this overarching threat hanging above the heads of students. So that's, I think, I don't know if that's the greatest answer to the question about grades, but I think it doesn't have to be as torturous as a lot of teachers think.
Yeah. Larry, as you were talking there, you made me realize something we probably should have just been more intentional to clarify at the very top of the segment is just to make sure we're on the same page with our audience, is the distinction between intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. And you gave a little bit of a an example earlier, but wondering if you could just very kind of succinctly distinguish between those two, just to make sure we're all on the same page.
Right. In intrinsic motivation, the primary energy to do something comes from within ourselves. With extrinsic motivation, intrinsic motivators are outside motivators, whether it's a threat, it's money, it's their grades, it's public approval, it's peer approval, and we are all motivated by both, right? I mean, it's not a question of either or, but I wrote the book for intellectual stimulation to help myself, and also the few bucks I'll get in royalties don't hurt either, right? But that over the long run, it's an intrinsic motivation is what's the strongest. I mean, nobody wants to feel like a rat in a maze, and that's one of the reasons why we want to focus more, I think, as educators, on the intrinsic kind.
Yeah. Thanks so much for that clarification. I know for sure, as an educator, I have not been above in my career, gold stars and extra credit to get a job done when it needs to be done, but also, recognizing the importance of deep conversations about what do you want for yourself, and are your behaviors today consistent with where you see yourself going in the long term, and how do you want to be perceived as a representative of your community when we travel to this place, and the kind of whole range of motivations that you speak to. So
the only people you're going to find who are entirely pure focused on intrinsic motivation in schools are student teachers before they get into the classroom.
You mean unpaid workers?
Yes, unpaid workers who have no experience, but it's and I mean, I've had 20 student teachers in my career. They're wonderful, but they it's and just as I had a much more unrealistic picture of the classroom before I entered it as a teacher. It's just the world as it is, right? But we've got to recognize that tension. I mean, if we don't recognize that tension, then we just become, pragmatic, focused on pragmatism, and the teachers who, just hang out in the break room complaining about the students, right? If we're just entirely focused on the world as it is. But if we're entirely focused on the world as we'd like it to be, we'll all be burning out tomorrow. So we've got to figure out how to bridge the two and how to move towards the world as we'd like it to be.
Now, Larry, you've mentioned before, and you've written in this book about your previous career as a community organizer before entering the classroom as a teacher. And in the book, you draw some comparisons between community organizing and this discussion around motivation, especially with regards to empowerment, and this idea that, like, similar to motivation, like when it comes to power, you can't just give it to somebody. The best you could do is create the conditions by which they take it, they become empowered. And with regards to the motivation debate, we're wondering, or the motivation conversation, I should say, we were wondering if you could say a little bit more about this relationship between power and motivation.
Right. Yeah, the word empower, is used a whole lot, and I think well-intentioned, but it drives me a little crazy just because of what you said, that I don't think you can give power to someone. you can, but you can create the conditions in which they can take it. And I think in the classroom, there are a variety of ways to do that. And oftentimes in my classes, I have what I call school leadership teams, where students in the class who are genuine leaders meet with me, and we regularly evaluate how the class is going and discuss changes that should be made. I have peer mentors and peer tutors in the classroom. And I think a really interesting example of the importance of power is, Abbott Elementary, of course, is every teacher's favorite TV show. And, a recent episode, the teacher gave the students the option, okay, we're going to have a school mural, and you get to decide what's on the school mural. And the students decided they wanted to have these sock puppets there. And he didn't want it. He thought that was ridiculous. And he, at one point he reversed their decision, right? And then had a revolt. But then then what ended up happening is they ended up doing a sock puppet mural, but within the mural, each student had their own panel where they were able to draw what they saw themselves doing 10, 20 years down the line. So you can't have it both ways, right? I mean, it's like you've got to, if you give students power, then you can also take it away. But if you create those conditions where students do have the ability to make decisions, you can negotiate with them about how to do it. And if you have, the conditions that support intrinsic motivation, like in Abbott Elementary, you can come to good compromises. With the school leadership teams, where it's a partnership. Just because they want to do something doesn't mean we do it, but we negotiate. I mean, power is really what it's all about. I mean, William Glasser talked about how most challenges in the classroom are focused on power, and students feeling like they don't have it because so many students don't have any power outside of the classroom either. Right? So we just got to, create conditions where students can exercise power, also consider agency within the classroom, and feel that they can do it. They can apply it outside as well, because so many of the challenges our students face are attributable to problems outside of the classroom. We can't growth mindset ourselves out of poverty and inequality, right? But we can, growth mindset can be one small element in helping our students see and develop strategies about how they can develop power to deal with both the small and the bigger reasons for the problems that they find in their lives.
I think that is a powerful point to end on, Larry, and just really appreciate you joining us here today to talk about a fascinating issue around student motivation, which, as you said, undergirds so much of the of the experience and often the struggle that takes place inside of schools and inside of classrooms each and every day. And folks, want to encourage you before you go to check out Larry's new book. I'm holding it up right here for folks who are listening. You, of course, can check below for the link to where you can get this book, but it's called the Student Motivation Handbook 50 Ways to Boost an Intrinsic Desire to Learn by our guest today, Larry Ferlazzo. Larry, thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thank you. And as I have said to you and to others, this show is a unique show in the education world, and lots of people should watch it, even when I'm not on it.
Thank you, Larry. Really appreciate that. Folks, that's it for today's seminar. But next up is our class dismissed. Stick around.
You.
Well, folks, we have come to that time in the episode where we like to pause for a moment, do a little reflecting, and give some shout outs to folks out there in the field of education doing just good work, man. So, Manuel, who we got today?
Yeah, man, we're going to shout out some students here. And I think in particular, this story here is one we're going to see a lot more of over the next several months. I think our young people have had enough. They have had enough. So for this class dismissed, we're shouting out students in Uvalde, Texas, who recently staged a walkout. First of all, we got this story from ABC News, thanks to some reporting by Kate Holland. And students of the Uvalde Independent Consolidated School District staged a pretty large walkout to protest gun violence, acknowledging the 19 elementary school children and 2 teachers who were killed after the massacre at Robb Elementary, which was about almost a year ago. And students said they took inspiration from students in Nashville who conducted a massive walkout of their own a week earlier related to the Covenant school shooting, which left 3 children and 3 faculty members dead. And that walkout has led to a lot of peaceful protesting at the Tennessee State House. And of course, some Tennessee state legislators being thrown out and all kinds of wildness. And for this walkout in Texas, one of the parents, Anna Rodriguez, her 10-year-old daughter was killed in the Robb Elementary shooting. And she showed up in support of the students. And she said, quote, "It means a lot. Look at them. Look at how many kids are out here." And she said they're scared for their lives and they care about what's happened here. And that means a lot to me. And that we have so much support from our students. So, Jeff, I think, I don't know, maybe, I'll be interested in your thoughts here, but I think we're going to see a lot more of these walkouts happening. I mean, young people have had enough, man. It's enough of these constant attacks on our schools, these school shootings. And shout out to these students for staging this walkout in solidarity with students out there in Tennessee. And yeah, man, something's got to shake, man. Something's got to shake. So definitely shout out to the youth for continuing to make sure their voices are heard.
Absolutely. Big shout out to these young folks who organized and executed this. And I think, especially in those places where we have legislatures who are refusing to take any actions in support of the cause of actually making schools safer or doing things that are outright insane, like arming teachers and that sort of thing. We are living in revolutionary times, like crazy laws are being put on the books that are harmful and threatening to schools as safe communities and to young people themselves, and they are speaking out as they should. And I think it's a beautiful exercise in youth voice and empowerment and democracy in action. And so if some of these lawmakers don't like what the students are saying, well, maybe they should do their jobs better. And then they won't have kids walking out in protest. So shout out to the youngsters down there in Uvalde, Texas. And of course, our continued thoughts and solidarity with the families there and really the whole community there that was so devastatingly affected by the school shootings there just a year or so ago. So absolutely a big shout out to those folks in Uvalde. Folks, that is it for today's episode. We have come to the end. Thanks so much to those of you who have been watching or listening and join us on this little journey that is each episode of All the Above. If you're new to the show, Thanks for checking it out. Your homework from today's episode is to like and subscribe to this show, to give us, that little 5-star rating. Make sure you show some love to our show. Share it with a friend. Share it with your network. Share it on social media. Every little bit that you do helps us. This is just a 2-person operation. It's Manuel and me. We are the all the above team, so we could really use your help. So folks, you can also go to our website. It's aotashow.com. There you can find links to all of our content. You can also go to our support page and become a monthly patron on our Anchor page. Any little bit you can give to the show helps us keep bringing this great content to you. Again, that's aotashow.com for the website. Thanks, folks. We'll see you next time.
Yeah.